Democracy is often imagined as a moment, a single day circled on the calendar, a walk to a polling booth, a button pressed, a paper marked, a result declared. In popular memory, democracy seems to arrive loudly and then depart, leaving silence in its wake. Between these moments, life resumes its ordinary rhythm. Streets fill, work continues, conversations drift elsewhere. Democracy appears to sleep. We assume it waits patiently for the next election, storing all its meaning in future promises and past verdicts, as if nothing important happens in the long stretch of time in between. But democracy does not vanish after votes are counted. It does not pack itself away with banners and slogans. It lingers quietly, woven into daily interactions, expectations, disappointments, and hopes. It breathes not through spectacle, but through routine, not through announcements, but through small, repeated acts. In the spaces between elections, people notice, question, comply, resist, adapt. They learn what power feels like when it is distant, and what responsibility feels like when it is close. These months and years are not empty pauses. They are the texture of democratic life itself. It is here that trust is slowly built or steadily eroded. Here that patience is tested and belief either deepens or thins out. Democracy in this time is not dramatic. It rarely announces itself. It exists as mood, as memory, as an unspoken sense of whether one's voice matters at all. The distance between elections is where expectations collide with experience, where promises fade into routines, where people adjust their hopes, sometimes lowering them, sometimes holding on quietly. Democracy here is less about choice and more about endurance, less about winning and more about living with outcomes. Listening to democracy only on election day is like listening to a single note and calling it a song. The fuller composition plays slowly, almost imperceptibly, across years. It reveals itself not in moments of excitement, but in how people speak, wait, tolerate, and imagine the future. This episode begins in that quiet stretch, in the time when banners are gone and slogans have softened into memory, when democracy is no longer an event, but a presence. Not something performed for a day, but something lived, unevenly and imperfectly, every day after. When voting ends, democracy does not end with it. A vote is a beginning, not a conclusion. It opens a conversation rather than closing a file. What follows is the longer work of living together, of watching choices unfold, and of deciding how much attention we continue to give after the ink dries. Beyond the ballot, democracy becomes participation of quieter kinds. It is present when people speak up in ordinary spaces, when they stay informed even when nothing urgent seems to be happening, when they notice small changes and decide they are worth caring about. Participation is not always loud. Often, it is simply staying engaged. There is also accountability, which rarely feels dramatic. It is the slow expectation that power should answer to reason, explanation, and fairness. Accountability lives in questions, asked politely, then firmly. In the refusal to forget promises, once applause fades. In the belief that authority is temporary and responsibility continuous, democracy also asks for restraint. Not everything that can be done should be done. Not every victory needs to be pressed to its limit. Restraint is invisible when it works, but deeply felt when it disappears. It is the quiet discipline of choosing stability over impulse, patience over dominance. Dialogue sits at the center of this everyday democracy. Not debates meant to defeat, but conversations meant to understand. Dialogue accepts disagreement without turning it into hostility. It assumes that others are not enemies by default. In dialogue, democracy sounds less like shouting and more like listening that lasts. These ideas rest on an older belief that power ultimately belongs to people, even when exercised indirectly. Popular sovereignty is not just a phrase. It is a feeling that decisions are not entirely alien, that authority has a human face, and that obedience is tied to legitimacy rather than fear. Alongside this is the comfort of knowing that rules apply even when no one is watching. The rule of law is experienced less as text and more as predictability, as the sense that tomorrow will not suddenly become arbitrary. That fairness, while imperfect, is not completely accidental. Seen this way, democracy is not an abstract system, but a shared habit. It survives through repetition, through people adjusting, questioning, forgiving, insisting, through moments of disappointment that do not immediately turn into withdrawal. Democracy is sustained not by enthusiasm alone, but by persistence. Between elections, democracy is learning to live with difference without dissolving into silence or noise. It is imperfect, slow, sometimes exhausting, but it is also resilient in ways that grand moments cannot capture. It exists because people keep returning to the idea that shared life is worth the effort. In the quiet months between elections, democracy leans on structures that rarely feel dramatic. These everyday institutions carry continuity. They do not campaign, celebrate, or rest. They work slowly, sometimes imperfectly, absorbing pressure so that public life does not swing wildly with every change of mood. The legislature, at its best, feels like a long conversation rather than a single decision. It revisits ideas, delays outcomes, and forces patience. Even when disagreements dominate, the process itself slows power down. That slowness is not a flaw. It is one way democracy protects itself from haste. The executive shapes daily experience most directly. It decides, implements, adjusts. Its presence is felt in routines rather than speeches. When it functions with steadiness, people rarely notice. When it overreaches or falters, everyday life feels unsettled. Democracy here depends less on inspiration and more on measured conduct. The judiciary enters democratic life quietly, often after everything else has failed. It does not promise satisfaction, only reasoned judgment. Its value lies in restraint and explanation. When people trust that disputes can be settled without force, democracy gains time to breathe, even in moments of deep disagreement. Constitutional bodies occupy an unusual space. They are meant to be present without being powerful in appearance. Their credibility rests on distance, neutrality, and repetition. When they function well, they seem boring. When they are questioned, democracy feels suddenly fragile, as if its background supports have shifted. Across many societies, reports quietly track how people feel about these institutions. Trust tends to rise when institutions appear predictable and fair, and fall when they seem partisan or opaque. Independence, once taken for granted, is increasingly noticed only when it feels uncertain or under strain. What emerges from these trends is not uniform decline or confidence, but uneven faith. People may distrust one institution while relying deeply on another. Democracy survives in this imbalance by allowing correction, not perfection. It assumes institutions will stumble, but hopes they can recover without collapsing public belief. These institutions do not create democracy on their own. They carry it forward when public attention drifts. They translate ideals into routine decisions, deadlines, hearings, and explanations. They are the steady hands that keep the system from tipping too sharply, even when pressure builds from all sides. Between elections, democracy rests less on passion and more on endurance. Institutions provide that endurance by repeating procedures, absorbing criticism, and continuing despite doubt. They are not symbols to admire, but mechanisms to rely on. Their quiet persistence is what allows democracy to last beyond moments of excitement. Parliament is often remembered for its votes, but it lives through conversation. Representation does not pause once seats are filled. It continues each time issues are raised, clarified, returned to, and sometimes left unresolved. Democracy here is not decisive in a single moment, but cumulative across many exchanges. Debates give shape to disagreement. They allow differences to be spoken aloud rather than hidden. Even when outcomes seem predictable, the act of speaking matters. It records concerns, tests arguments, and signals that public issues deserve time. Debate is democracy, thinking out loud, slowly and imperfectly. Questions asked on the floor often appear routine, but they serve a deeper purpose. They insist that explanations are owed, that decisions did not emerge from nowhere. Questions keep power conversational rather than silent. They remind representatives that authority is accompanied by the obligation to answer again and again. Committees work away from attention, but they reflect democracy at close range. Smaller groups listening, revising, disagreeing without urgency. Committees allow detail to matter. They turn broad promises into practical scrutiny. Their value lies not in visibility, but in patience and the willingness to stay with complexity. Deliberation is the thread connecting all of this. It is the belief that discussion can improve outcomes even when consensus is unlikely. Deliberation does not guarantee wisdom, but it slows certainty. It creates space for reconsideration, for second thoughts, for the possibility that listening changes direction. In recent years, some studies have quietly noted changes in how often these processes occur. Fewer sitting days, shorter discussions, tighter schedules. These observations are usually descriptive, not accusatory. They invite reflection on how time itself shapes the quality of democratic conversation. Less time does not automatically mean less democracy, but it alters its texture. When discussions are compressed, priorities shift. Some voices grow sharper, others quieter. The rhythm changes. What once unfolded gradually may feel hurried. These shifts matter not because of nostalgia, but because tempo influences understanding. Representation is not only about presence, but about attention. When representatives listen, revisit, and remain engaged, democracy feels closer. When interactions feel rushed, distance grows. These are subtle changes, difficult to measure, yet deeply felt by those who watch public life unfold over time. Beyond voting, Parliament represents the ongoing attempt to think collectively. It is imperfect, uneven, sometimes frustrating. But in its debates, questions, committees, and silences, democracy continues its work, not as a spectacle, but as a sustained effort to speak, listen, and stay in conversation. Between elections, the judiciary occupies a quieter rhythm of democracy. It does not ask for attention, yet it receives disputes that cannot wait for political seasons. Its presence reminds society that disagreements have a place to go, and that unresolved tensions need not spill endlessly into the streets. Judicial review is one way democracy checks itself. It is not about opposing popular will, but about asking whether power has remained within agreed boundaries. This questioning is often slow and technical, but its effect is emotional. It reassures people that decisions are not final simply because they are forceful. Constitutional interpretation adds another layer to this work. Over time, meanings deepen. Words written long ago are read alongside changing realities. Through interpretation, democracy stays flexible without becoming unstable. It allows continuity without freezing society in an earlier moment, letting principles travel across generations. Some of the most lasting democratic shifts have come through such readings. Interpretations that widen personal freedoms, strengthen dignity, or protected voices at the margins. These moments rarely felt revolutionary at the time. They unfolded gradually through reasoning, explanation, and repetition, embedding themselves quietly into everyday expectations. Access to the judiciary matters as much as its authority. Public interest litigation changed who could knock on the court's door. It reduced distance, allowing concerns to travel upward even when individuals felt powerless. This openness made democracy feel reachable, not reserved only for those with resources or influence. Through this access, the judiciary often hears stories rather than arguments. Experiences of exclusion, neglect, or harm find expression in legal language. The process is imperfect and sometimes overstretched, but it reflects an idea that democracy listens even when voices arrive fragmented and incomplete. Respect for the judiciary does not come from agreement with every outcome. It grows from trust in process, from the sense that decisions are reasoned, not arbitrary. That restraint matters, that explanations are offered. In this predictability, democracy finds stability during periods of political uncertainty. At times, the judiciary is asked to carry expectations it cannot fully meet. It cannot replace politics or resolve every social conflict. Its role is narrower, but essential. By holding space for fairness and interpretation, it buys time for society to negotiate its differences elsewhere. Between elections, the judiciary keeps democracy anchored. It does not generate momentum, but it prevents drift. It reminds citizens that rights do not expire with ballots, and that accountability does not depend entirely on cycles of power. In its quiet continuity, democracy is sustained, one judgment at a time. Between elections, media becomes one of the most visible spaces where democracy breathes. It fills the silence left after campaigns end. Through stories, discussions, and questions, it shapes what people notice and what they overlook. Democracy here is not decided, but narrated, interpreted, and constantly reframed. Information flow is its first task. Not just breaking news, but continuity, following issues beyond their moment of attention, returning to unresolved questions. When information moves steadily, Democracy feels informed rather than startled. It allows people to form opinions gradually instead of reacting only when urgency is manufactured. Public debate grows from this flow. Media offers a stage where disagreements meet an audience. At its best, debate widens understanding rather than narrowing positions. It exposes listeners to perspectives they may not encounter otherwise. Even imperfect debate signals that differences can exist without dissolving into silence. Investigative journalism carries a different rhythm. It is slower, quieter, often uncomfortable. It looks beneath appearances and asks why patterns repeat. Its democratic value lies not in outrage, but in persistence. By staying with a story, it reminds power that time alone does not erase accountability. Agenda setting is a subtler influence. Media does not tell people what to think, but it often shapes what they think about. By choosing which issues return night after night, it creates a shared sense of relevance. Democracy here is guided gently, sometimes invisibly, by attention itself. In recent years, studies have noted shifts in this landscape. Media ownership has changed hands, platforms have multiplied, and the pace of information has accelerated. These changes are structural rather than personal. They alter incentives, timelines, and priorities, reshaping how democratic conversations are carried forward. Trust has become uneven. Some audiences rely deeply on familiar voices, while others approach information with suspicion. Declining trust does not always mean disengagement. Often it means people are listening differently, cross-checking, doubting, filtering. Democracy adjusts by becoming more fragmented, not necessarily more silent. Misinformation adds another layer of complexity. Falsehoods travel quickly, especially when they feel emotionally satisfying. Studies point less to malice and more to speed and scale. In this environment, democracy depends not only on correction, but on patience, context, and the slow rebuilding of credibility. Media, between elections, is neither hero nor villain. It reflects society's anxieties, interests, and contradictions. Its influence is real, but not absolute. Democracy here survives through plural voices, uneven trust, and constant negotiation over meaning. It remains a crowded, contested space where attention itself becomes a form of power. Between elections, civil society gathers democracy into organized forms, not as a single voice, but as many small ones. Groups form around causes, identities, professions, and shared concerns. They create spaces where participation feels collective rather than solitary, and where attention can be sustained beyond individual effort. Non-governmental organizations often translate diffuse concerns into structured work. They research, document, assist, and sometimes question. Their presence is most visible where needs persist quietly. Democracy here is not performative. It is administrative, repetitive, and patient, turning broad ideals into daily engagement. Associations and unions reflect another layer of participation. They speak from lived experience rather than abstract principle. Through meetings, negotiations, and representation, they keep everyday issues from disappearing. These groups remind democracy that work, welfare, and dignity are not seasonal topics, but continuous realities. Movements operate differently. They rise when existing channels feel insufficient. Their energy is uneven, sometimes intense, sometimes brief. Movements do not always seek permanence. They seek recognition. In doing so, they expand the range of what democracy is forced to notice even after attention fades. Citizen groups occupy the most local spaces. Neighborhood forums, informal collectives, issue-based gatherings. Their strength lies in proximity. They respond quickly, speak plainly, and often dissolve once problems shift. Democracy here is intimate, grounded, and shaped by familiarity rather than ideology. Across countries, reports have begun to track how civic space is changing. Some note new forms of organization, others point to constraints, regulations, or reduced room for action. These observations are descriptive rather than alarmist, highlighting how participation adapts when conditions shift. Shrinking space does not always mean silence. Sometimes it produces quieter strategies, less visible coordination, or more cautious language. Civil society adjusts its tone and methods. Democracy, in turn, becomes less confrontational and more negotiated, shaped by what feels possible at a given moment. Civil society does not replace elections or institutions. It fills the intervals. It carries concerns forward when formal attention moves elsewhere. Its contribution lies not in winning outcomes, but in sustaining presence. Between elections, democracy survives partly because organized participation refuses to disappear completely. Democracy often feels closest at the local level. It appears not as an idea, but as a meeting, a notice, a decision about water, roads, or waste. Here, democracy is less symbolic and more practical, shaped by problems that arrive daily and demand immediate attention. Panchayati Raj institutions were imagined as this everyday face of democracy. They bring decision-making closer to homes and habits. When they work, people see their concerns reflected quickly. When they struggle, democracy feels distant again, even though it is physically nearby. Urban local bodies carry a similar responsibility in more crowded spaces. Cities grow fast, needs multiply, and coordination becomes complex. Local councils and officials negotiate competing demands quietly. Democracy here is not about grand vision, but about balancing urgency, scarcity, and fairness in ordinary life. Everyday decision-making at this level shapes how people experience governance. Which street is repaired first? How public spaces are maintained? Whose complaint receives attention? These choices rarely make headlines, but they influence trust deeply. Democracy is felt in responsiveness, not rhetoric. Governance studies often return to questions of devolution. How much authority truly rests locally? What remains centralized? These debates are ongoing and rarely settled. They reflect a tension between uniformity and flexibility, between control and autonomy, that plays out quietly across towns and villages. Capacity is another recurring concern. Local bodies are expected to manage complex tasks with limited staff and expertise. When capacity is thin, intentions falter. Democracy then depends not only on participation, but on training, continuity, and the ability to learn from experience over time. Fiscal constraints shape everything. Without resources, decisions become symbolic. Studies note that many local bodies rely heavily on higher levels for funds. This dependence affects priorities and pace. Democracy here becomes a negotiation between ambition and affordability, between what is needed and what is possible. Yet, despite these limits, local governance remains a vital democratic space. People attend meetings, raise issues, adapt expectations. They learn how decisions are made and why delays occur. This familiarity tempers frustration and builds a grounded understanding of shared responsibility. At the grassroots, democracy is not abstract. It is visible in attendance, participation, and follow-up. It survives through routine interaction rather than dramatic change. Between elections, local governance keeps democracy alive by reminding people that collective life is shaped slowly and imperfectly, close to where they live. Between elections, participation often unfolds in ordinary, almost unnoticed ways. People ask questions, request information, attend meetings, speak to officials, or join discussions that never become headlines. Democracy here is not staged. It is practiced quietly, through curiosity, persistence, and everyday engagement. The use of information requests reflects this quieter participation. Asking how decisions were made, how money was spent, or why delays occurred turns governance into something legible. Transparency is not dramatic. It is cumulative. Each answer received adds a small layer of understanding to shared public life. Public consultations offer another space, often imperfect and uneven. They invite people into conversations before decisions are finalized. Sometimes participation is thin, sometimes voices feel repetitive. Yet, the process itself matters. It acknowledges that choices affect many, and that listening, even briefly, carries democratic value. Social audits bring scrutiny closer to lived experience. They compare records with reality. What was promised with what arrived? These exercises rarely feel confrontational when done calmly. They are collective acts of verification. Democracy here is about alignment between words and outcomes, checked patiently over time. Peaceful protest occupies a different emotional register. It appears when other forms feel insufficient. Protest is not constant rebellion, but expression. It signals that something matters deeply enough to disrupt routine. When peaceful, it stretches democracy without tearing it, making discomfort visible rather than explosive. Civic dialogue fills the spaces between these acts. Conversations at workplaces, homes, classrooms, and public spaces shape opinions slowly. Dialogue does not require agreement. It requires presence. Through repeated exchange, democracy becomes a shared language rather than a distant system, even when views diverge sharply. Governance reports often note how participation patterns are changing. Digital tools expand access while attention fragments. Transparency initiatives coexist with fatigue. These observations are descriptive, not celebratory. They suggest that participation adapts to context, shaped by time, trust, and the effort people can sustain. Everyday participation does not always feel empowering. It can feel procedural, slow, or inconclusive. Yet, its democratic value lies in continuity. It keeps channels open. It reminds authority that observation persists even without spectacle. Democracy here survives not through intensity, but through repetition. Between elections, these small acts accumulate. They do not transform systems overnight. They soften edges, correct paths, and keep conversation alive. Democracy, lived this way, becomes less about moments of choice and more about habits of attention, inquiry, and shared responsibility. Between elections, digital spaces have become new meeting grounds for democracy. Conversations that once stayed local now travel instantly. Opinions form in public view. Democracy here feels faster, louder, and more crowded, shaped by screens rather than rooms, and by immediacy rather than patience. Social media platforms turn everyday expression into political signal. A comment, a share, a silence can all be read as positions. These spaces lower barriers to entry, allowing many to speak who once stayed unheard. At the same time, they compress nuance, rewarding clarity over complexity. Online consultations attempt to bridge distance between decision-makers and citizens. Forms replace meetings. Feedback arrives asynchronously. Participation widens, but depth varies. Some voices engage thoughtfully, others briefly. Democracy here experiments with scale, testing how inclusion and deliberation can coexist without overwhelming attention or intention. Digital platforms also change political communication itself. Messages are shorter. Tone sharpens. Emotion travels faster than explanation. Studies often note how speed reshapes content, favoring reaction over reflection. This does not erase democratic conversation, but it alters its rhythm and expectations. Misinformation enters easily into these spaces. False claims spread not only through intent, but through design and velocity. Research points to how repetition and emotional charge amplify reach. Democracy responds unevenly, relying on correction, literacy, and trust that are slower to build than rumors. Polarization is another frequently noted trend. Online environments tend to cluster agreement. People encounter affirmation more than challenge. This can strengthen identity while narrowing understanding. Democracy here becomes fragmented, not absent, divided into parallel conversations that rarely intersect but continue simultaneously. Internet penetration shapes who participates digitally and how. As access expands, new voices arrive with different priorities and styles. Studies suggest that digital democracy is uneven, reflecting broader social patterns. Inclusion grows, but so do differences in influence, visibility, and confidence online. Despite these tensions, digital spaces do not replace older democratic forms. They layer over them. Online discussion spills into offline life, and vice versa. Democracy adapts by absorbing these tools, learning slowly which practices sustain dialogue and which exhaust it. Why? Between elections, digital democracy remains unfinished. It offers reach without guarantee, speed without certainty, voice without resolution. Its value lies not in perfection, but in presence. It keeps democracy audible, contested, and alive in new spaces, even as society learns how to listen differently. Between elections, democracy also carries weight. It is asked to endure uncertainty, disappointment, and repetition. Challenges appear not as sudden breakdowns, but as gradual thinning. A sense that something once trusted now feels heavier to carry, requiring more effort to believe in. Declining trust is often described quietly in surveys and reports. Not a rejection of democracy itself, but a hesitation toward its intermediaries. People continue to value the idea, while doubting its delivery. This gap between belief and experience creates fatigue rather than anger, weariness rather than revolt. Institutions feel this strain over time. Processes multiply. Expectations rise. Patience shortens. What once felt stabilizing can begin to feel slow or distant. Institutional fatigue is subtle. It shows up in delayed responses, cautious decisions, and an increasing reliance on routine to manage growing complexity. Media pressure adds another layer. The demand for constant attention compresses timelines. Issues cycle quickly, leaving little room for follow-through. Reports note how depth competes with speed. Democracy here struggles not with silence, but with noise that makes sustained focus harder to maintain. Citizens feel these pressures too. Participation requires energy. Over time, repeated engagement without visible impact can lead to withdrawal. Disengagement does not always look like protest or rejection. Often it appears as quiet retreat, fewer questions asked, less time given to public matters. Global democracy reports often capture these patterns in aggregate. They speak of backsliding, stagnation, or uneven performance. These terms sound abstract, but they reflect everyday feelings of distance. Democracy in these accounts is not collapsing everywhere. It is unevenly strained, unevenly renewed. Polarization and distrust interact with fatigue. When disagreement feels permanent, dialogue becomes exhausting. People choose certainty over complexity, familiarity over engagement. Democracy then risks becoming procedural rather than participatory, maintained by habit more than conviction during long stretches between elections. Challenge does not equal failure. Democracies have always lived with tension. The difference now lies in pace and scale. Changes arrive faster. Expectations grow heavier. Institutions and citizens adjust unevenly, sometimes lagging behind the pressures placed upon them by contemporary life. Between elections, democracy is tested not by dramatic moments, but by endurance. By whether trust can be rebuilt slowly, whether tension can be sustained without spectacle, whether engagement can feel meaningful again. These challenges do not announce endings. They quietly shape what democracy becomes next. Between elections, democracy asks for a particular temperament. Not excitement, but steadiness. Not constant certainty, but the ability to live with ambiguity. Democratic life unfolds slowly, and those who inhabit it learn to wait, to observe, and to accept that not every question receives an immediate answer. Restraint becomes an unseen virtue in this time. The choice not to push every disagreement to its edge. The willingness to pause before judging. Restraint allows coexistence in difference. It keeps shared life intact when opinions clash and outcomes disappoint, preserving space for return and reconsideration. Constitutional morality lives here, away from ceremonies and texts. It appears in how power is exercised and received. In the respect shown to process even when results frustrate. It is a quiet agreement that rules matter not only when they favor us, but especially when they do not. Responsibility in democracy is rarely dramatic. It is carried through consistency, through paying attention without constant reward, through recognizing that participation does not always feel impactful, yet remains necessary. Responsibility here is less about influence and more about presence, less about winning and more about staying engaged. A democratic temperament also accepts limits, that institutions are human, imperfect, and slow, that disagreement will persist, that justice unfolds unevenly. Accepting limits does not mean indifference. It means understanding that endurance, not purity, often sustains shared political life over time. Citizenship, in this sense, is not an identity to display, but a relationship to maintain. It deepens through listening as much as speaking, through tolerance without silence, through disagreement without withdrawal. Democracy grows quieter here, but also sturdier, rooted in habits rather than moments. Between elections, maturity shows itself in how people carry disappointment, whether it hardens into cynicism or softens into reflection, whether frustration turns into disengagement or patient critique. These responses shape democracy's character long before any formal choice is offered again. In this quieter stretch, democracy becomes less about outcomes and more about conduct, about how power is met, how difference is held, how time is endured together. Its future is written not only in ballots, but in the everyday temperaments that allow shared life to continue. Democracy does not pause when election days pass. It settles into routines, carried by institutions that continue their work without applause, by media that returns to unfinished stories, by civil society that organizes patiently, by citizens who remain present even when attention drifts elsewhere. Between elections, democracy becomes quieter, almost invisible. It survives in procedures repeated, questions revisited, disagreements managed rather than resolved. Its strength lies not in constant affirmation, but in the willingness of many parts to keep moving, even when belief feels fragile or outcomes feel distant. Institutions absorb pressure by continuing. Media sustains conversation by choosing what to return to. Civil society keeps concerns alive when urgency fades. None of these alone define democracy. Together they create a background hum that prevents public life from slipping entirely into indifference. Citizens complete this picture without ceremony, by noticing, by remembering, by staying just engaged enough to care. Democracy here is not heroic. It is habitual. It asks for attention without spectacle, for patience without guarantee, for participation that does not always announce itself. This everyday democracy is uneven and imperfect. Some days it feels resilient, other days strained, but it persists because it is distributed. No single moment carries it. No single actor sustains it. It continues through shared responsibility stretched quietly across time. As night settles, democracy sounds less like debate and more like breathing. Steady, unremarkable, essential. It exists in the spaces we rarely name, between actions, between decisions, between elections. It does not demand conclusion, only continuation. And so it remains, unfinished, ongoing, waiting to be noticed again. Silence,